What's going on, everyone? It's Ben from YGO from Zero back with another Retro Yu-Gi-Oh video, and in this video we're going to be diving into the results of the recent Breaker format tournament. Now, this was a really exciting event. We actually live streamed the finals on the channel the other night. So definitely check out that final stream if you want to see some fun Breaker gameplay. But the format is definitely not solved, and that's what this tournament really showed, and that's what that finals really showed. A lot of people thought that Scientist FTK was going to be the best deck around, and it was not. It actually lost the tournament in the finals pretty decisively. So I think that shows that there's a lot of interesting exploration that can be done in Breaker format in the future, and I think that these results definitely speak to that. So let's just dive into them and see what they actually say about the state of the game. But before we do, if you enjoy Retro Yu-Gi-Oh content and you're already subscribed to the channel, definitely subscribe to the channel. We're almost at 1,000 subs. It'd be really, really awesome if we could get there by the end of the year. And also, if you want to play any of the formats that I discuss in any of my videos, then also head on over to the YGO from Zero Discord server as well. It's a great place to find games in these formats and also to play in events like this tournament that we held here. This was held in the YGO from Zero Discord server, and if you want to join any future events like it, then that's the place to be. But now that we've gotten that out of the way, let's dive into the results here. And I think it's very, very interesting. Now, when looking at an event to see how the meta is sort of shaken up, it's often good to look at the deck types that are represented because, if there's a clear meta pick, then oftentimes the majority of people will be on that. And if the meta is very diverse, then you'll be able to see that as well. And I think from this wheel, you can definitely see that it is a very, very diverse metagame here. So there were 19 people total. 4 of them brought Scientist FTK, 3 of them brought Tomato Control, 2 of them brought Hand Control, and 2 of them brought Dark Magician Turbo. And after that, it was a free-for-all. So we have categories like Anti-Meta Stun, Goat Control, Earth Beat, Scientist Control, Pac-Man, Stallburn, Aggro Machine, and Spellcaster Control. And each of those were just repped by one player each. And when you see a sort of wheel that diverse, that means that there's a lot of experimentation going on and nothing is really set in stone at this point. And I think that even after the results of this tournament, there's still a lot more experimentation to be done. As I mentioned, like a lot of people went into this thinking like Scientist FTK was going to be the best deck. And so a lot of people designed their decks to beat Scientist FTK. And Scientist FTK was extremely good. There was someone in the top 2 who was playing Scientist FTK. However, it was by no means the best deck. I mean, once it was countered, once a deck, came to the scene that was bringing hard counters to the Scientist FTK deck, it was not able to actually put up the results here. And that will potentially shift the meta in the future. Maybe people will be less concerned with Scientist FTK and more just play things on the side to deal with it if they go up against that matchup. Or maybe these Scientist FTK decks will adapt and maybe instead of just going all in on the FTK, they sort of just adopt a smaller engine, like, a copy of Scientist, copy of Turtle, and then 3 last fills potentially. It remains to be seen, and I think that there's a lot of experimentation that can happen there. But I'm really happy to see that people really were experimenting and bring decks to this tournament. And again, it is a small tournament, so it's kind of tough to see how this will translate to if we hold bigger tournaments for this format in the future, what will actually rise to the top and what will sort of fall by the wayside. But I do think that this is a very, very interesting sort of spread of decks, and it led to a very interesting sort of top cut. So I also do have the top 4 deck lists that I do want to share with y'all, and each one of them was representing kind of a different deck, which is really, really cool to see. So let's start with the 4th place slot, which was piloted by Soul Emerald 69. This is like Dark Magician Turbo. So, I showed off on my channel before a Dark Paladin sort of deck that was playing triple skill Dark Magician plus Dark Magician. The idea is you go into Dark Magician that way. You're playing a Versaga the Destroyer that you can bring out off of Mystic Tomato, and you've got polymerizations in there to fuse into Dark Paladin, which is an extremely strong fusion monster, able to shut down your opponent's spells. Soul instead went for a different route. They were just playing triple skill Dark Magician as a big beater that can occasionally bring out a big 2500 attack monster. And given all the powerful spells in this format, that isn't necessarily the hardest thing to do. Now, of course, Dark Magician can be a brick in your hand, so that is a bit unfortunate. But if you do manage to bring it out, it can be pretty decent. And you can also revive it from grave, which makes it good discard fodder if you are playing discard cards like Tribe Infecting Virus. Now, I think that there are definitely things that, you could change about this list. Potentially, maybe this list just won because it was playing triple skill Dark Magician, which is a 1900 attack point monster. It's very strong. It was also playing like Don Zalug and Goblin Attack Force, so it's got a bit of a warrior package here paired with double Rhoda. So maybe that also helped it out quite a bit. But I do think it's pretty cool to see this deck actually managing to make it to top four. It was a small tournament, so maybe this is just, one of those jank decks that made it further than it otherwise would have. But Soul did a very good record with this deck, and I think this shows that there's definitely room to experiment with this in the future, and I'm curious to see what people will do with it in the future going forward. And you'll note in the side, there is double Wang Hu here, which is perfect for the Scientist matchup, as Wang Hu really shuts down that matchup. And there are also things like double Book of Moon as well, which is another good sort of tool against the Scientist deck, as, it can disrupt your opponent's Scientist plays. Besides that, the side deck is pretty standard, I think. You got a Royal Decree, you've got Harpies, you got Heavy. Those are for more back row heavy decks. You got Nobleman Crossout. You've also got a Sasuke Samurai as well, which can be searched off the Rhoda and hit into your opponent's sets, which is very nice. Yatagarasu in here as well to shut down your opponent if they're playing a bit of a slower strategy. I think this deck is really, really sick, and I encourage you to try it out in the future if it piques your interest. The next deck I want to talk about in top 4 is also a spellcaster-based deck, and that is GBO's Spellcaster Control List. Now, this is making use of the powerful Apprentice Magician engine. Apprentice Magician is a spellcaster that can bring out other spellcasters from deck, like Magician of Faith, which is very strong, bring back a variety of powerful spells, as well as Magical Scientist, which is one of the most powerful cards in this format. Crazy, it's at 3, and this is just very, very strong. So Apprentice Magician has that flexibility. It can also be used potentially like, reset a counter on Breaker, which is another very good card in this format. So it's got a lot of utility in a lot of different situations, and if you are bringing out cards off of it, like let's say you bring a Magician of Faith out off of it, flip the Magician, add a spell from grave to hand, then you've also got Air Knight Parshath as well to capitalize on that. You contribute out this, get in for damage, draw a card, and that can be really, really brutal. So I think this deck is a really, really neat idea. Now, with the Apprentice Magician engine, you can be in a little bit of trouble if you run into Scientist FTK decks, because they're not likely to be attacking into your sets. That can cause you some issues, but GBO is playing some cards that can really disrupt these Scientist decks. Things like Book of Moon is very good at disrupting their combos. You can also do things that sort of shut them off before they get going. Like if they brick and you bring out Yatagarasu, hit in and draw lock them, then that can also shut down their gameplay. So I think this deck is really, really cool, really, really innovative to see. And I also really like the Air Knight Parshaths in here. Air Knight Parshath is kind of an interesting card. It used to be like really, really strong in GOAT. Then people realized maybe it's not really the best in GOAT, and so they shifted away from that. But it could still be very powerful in these other DM era formats leading up to GOAT. And so I think it's cool to see experimentation with it. And it did pretty well for GBO here. So very, very cool to see. The rest of the spell lineup is pretty standard. You'll note that there's a Premature Burial, which isn't played in every sort of list, but this is very good in a deck that is playing all these Air Knight Parshaths. And also, you can recycle it with Magician of Faith, so it's another power spell to have there. For the side deck, there's some interesting sort of techs. There's Jowgen the Spiritualist, which can also shut down Scientist decks, although I don't think quite as well as something like Wang Hu. Also, there's Double Non-Aggression Area, which again can shut down the Scientist decks because it prevents them from summoning. But it's also kind of weird because it's like a delayed card, so I'm not really sure about the Non-Aggression Area and the Jowgens, but they are kind of interesting here. And I think that this list is also extremely sick. And so I hope to see people experimenting with it in future, especially given that, like, as I mentioned at the beginning of this video, I think that Scientist FTK decks might not be as popular in this format going forward. And in cases like that, decks that are built more around battling can really, sort of play into this and trigger your Apprentice Magicians, get up at your powerful spellcasters, and really make this deck shine. So I think this will be interesting to see how people deal with this in the future and whether people expand upon this as well. But now that we've covered the 3rd and 4th place decks, let's dive into the top 2 and see which decks made it to finals. So the 2nd place deck list piloted by DK0 is a Scientist FTK list, and this is pretty standard for Scientist FTK. You can watch my video on the subject if you want to see exactly how this deck works, but basically it's aiming to win on the 1st or 2nd turn, basically what you do. if you're able to bring out Scientist and Turtle on field at the same time, you basically win the game, because you can bring out enough fusion monsters off of Scientist and tribute them off with Catapult Turtle to deal exactly 8,000 damage to your opponent. And this deck is aimed at just, assembling that combo. You've got things like Gill Swords, which can special summon itself out. You tribute that off for Catapult Turtle, activate Last Will. That's the end of the game. Last Will incredibly strong in this deck. You've also got Metamorphosis to trigger the Last Wills. Metamorphosis can also, come in handy in a pinch if you don't draw the combo, but you do draw like Scientist. You can summon out Scientist, pay 1,000, bring out like, Dark Balter, then meta out another Dark Balter. And Dark Balter is just a very, very powerful card on its own. So this deck does have some sort of secondary game plans, but its main game plan is just to win through the Scientist FTK. And the fact that it made it to second place in this tournament shows how strong that can be, as it is a combo that can come up. And even if you're not going first, if your opponent doesn't have a way to disrupt your combo here, or if you draw like Heavy Storm, Harpy Feather Duster, or Giant Trunade, then you could potentially win either way. So very, very strong deck, but as the results of this tournament show, definitely not the strongest deck around. And, I think definitely people went into this tournament sort of thinking it was a lot better than it potentially is. And it definitely is by no means a tier 0 threat. And I think that means that there's a lot of room for experimentation in the other decks in this format to sort of try and take this deck down. So very, very cool to see that this deck did not actually win the format tournament here. And I'm curious to see what people will do with this in the future. Maybe they pivot away from going all in on the FTK and play a smaller engine of Scientist and Turtle, as I mentioned earlier. It remains to be seen, but I'm excited to see what people actually do with this. But now that we've covered all the decks leading up to number 1, let's talk about the topping deck of this tournament. At the very top of this tournament, undefeated entirely, like they didn't lose a single match this tournament, we've got Aratos piloting. This was called Tomato Control in the sort of format library coverage of it, and there's a link to the format library coverage if you're interested in diving more into these decks and more into the sort of breakdowns and stuff for them. But I'm not sure I'd necessarily call it Tomato Control, even though Tomato is a very, very key part of it. I think it's more just like a bunch of good cards put together in a way that counters Scientist. So I'm not quite sure I'd call it like anti-Scientist, but it definitely does have a lot of aggression that can be very difficult for Scientist decks to handle. So, you could call it anti-science, you could call it Tomato Control, but either way, this is just a very, very good deck at getting out a bunch of damage, preventing the Scientist deck from actually winning, and also just holding its own against other sorts of just good decks. Some interesting text here, the Gravekeeper's Spies. Very, very interesting choice. As I mentioned before, Scientist decks aren't necessarily going to use their battle phase as much, so this could potentially just be a dead card in hand. But as we saw in some of the games that Aratos played, this can be extremely powerful, getting another monster on board and being able to hit in for a lot of damage, and just, continuing to get really aggressive and just sort of prevent your opponent from having enough life points to actually pull off any Scientist combos. Also, you'll notice that there are 2 Scientists in this deck as well. Scientist is a very good utility card if you're not doing the FTK, as there are very powerful fusion monsters in your fusion deck that you can bring out for a variety of purposes. So I think this also makes a lot of sense here. And then the other cards here are just kind of good, just good cards. You've got King Tiger Wanghu, which is, specifically teched against Scientist decks, as this really does shut down a lot of their plays. But you've also got stuff like Break of the Magical Warrior, Tribe Infecting Virus. You've got Exiled Forest, Fiber Jar, Magician of Faith at 1 copy here. You've got a lot of different things here that are just really, really good cards. And, the spell lineup is pretty similar to that. It's just basically all the good cards in this format that you'd want to play in a general sort of good stuff spell deck. For the traps, there's, of course, all the power traps, but there are some interesting choices here, like Double Torrential Tribute. This can be very good against Scientist decks, and also a Jar of Greed, which is quite interesting. I'm curious if Jar of Greed actually did come up with them in the tournament that much, because Jar of Greed just seems like such an underwhelming card, or you probably want to be playing like Disruption to the Scientist deck, as opposed to just a card to draw you into more stuff, but it worked out well enough for them here, it looks like. So, maybe there is something here. Maybe people will experiment with it more. The side deck is pretty standard for this format, I think. You got 2 more Wanghu here to bring in against Scientist decks. You've got a new Doria, which pairs extremely well with your tomatoes here. This can be a monster pop, which is very, very nice. You've got a Spirit Reaper as well to both wall up and also potentially get in for some discards. You've got a third Scientist and a Turtle in case you want to go for the FTK yourself. You got a Parshath here to bring in if your opponent's playing more defensive monsters or like scapegoats. This can be good at punishing that. You got Double Knock and a Ceasefire here to punish more flip focus decks. You've got a Book of Moon potentially coming in when you side in the knocks. You got Heavy Storm to deal with your opponent's back row, Double Dust Tornado to deal with that as well, and another copy of Torrential too. So I think this deck is really, really sick. Very, very good list on Aratos' part here. And, they played this very, very well. You can watch the finals to see them in action playing this deck, and you can see how badly this deck, basically just, brutally tears apart Scientist. So I think this was really cool to see this. I think it's really cool to see the metagame sort of warp itself around the Scientist FTK, and I'm curious to see how the metagame warps itself in the future. So let me know down in the comments below what you think this format will sort of evolve into, whether these decks will drastically change more in the future as people maybe play less Scientist FTK, or whether you think people are going to switch around Scientist FTK completely and, potentially improve upon the deck and make it more of a threat. I'm curious to hear your thoughts as always, so let me know in the comments below. And until next time, I've been Ben from YGO from Zero, and I'm signing off.